My name is Harold Miller. I'm 81 years old, and I live alone in a house I built with my own hands back in 1969. It sits at the edge of a quiet street in a mid-sized town in Ohio, the kind of town where every neighbor used to know your name, where kids once rode their bikes up and down the sidewalk and played until the porch lights came on. Now, those sidewalks are mostly empty, and the houses I helped raise have been painted over so many times they barely resemble the neighborhood of my memory. My own house still looks the same: white siding, red shutters, a small porch with a creaky swing that I fixed a dozen times over the years, but still groans like an old man every time it's sat on. I used to sit there with my wife, Ellen, every summer evening for almost 5 decades. She'd knit or do crossword puzzles, and I'd sip coffee, just enjoying the silence, the air, the way her foot would occasionally brush against mine. She passed away 9 years ago this September. Stroke, quick, unfair. I've kept the porch swing exactly as it was, as if she might return to it one day. Inside the house, everything remains in its place. Not out of neglect, but because moving anything would feel like tearing pages out of a book you haven't finished reading. Ellen's scarves still hang on the coat rack. Her favorite ceramic mug, the one with the bluebirds she painted at a community class in '82, sits beside mine in the cupboard. The smell of cinnamon and old paper lingers in the kitchen, just as it did when she used to bake apple pies in late October, when the air would turn crisp and the leaves outside the kitchen window turned the color of rust. I don't bake anymore. I hardly cook. Most days I get by on toast, soup, and coffee. But every now and then, I'll open one of her old recipe books and run my hand across her notes in the margins. She always wrote in cursive, even when she was in a hurry. And for a few minutes, it's almost as if I can hear her voice in the room, again telling me to be careful not to burn the crust. I had 2 sons. Now I have 1. The older, Daniel, died in a car accident when he was 27. He was a gentle soul, wanted to be a teacher, loved the outdoors. The day he died, something inside me cracked, a soundless fracture that never fully healed. My younger son, Rick, survived, married Amanda, and moved to Columbus about a decade ago. He works in insurance. She does something with interior design, though I've never seen any room she's decorated that didn't feel like a hotel lobby. They visit a few times a year, usually for the holidays. Or rather, they used to. In the last 2 years, their visits have dwindled to little more than quick drop-ins, often with a hint of obligation, like they're ticking something off a to-do list. They never stay long. I try not to ask too many questions, because asking means hearing answers I already know. They're busy, tired, have plans. There's always something more important than an old man sitting in a drafty house filled with photographs and silence. Those photographs, they are my sanctuary. I've spent decades photographing everything, not just birthdays and weddings, but the mundane, the in-between moments. Ellen sipping coffee on the porch in her robe, Daniel fishing by the lake with his arms too small for the rod, Rick building a Lego tower on the living room rug. I kept them all, printed them, framed some, tucked most into albums. In total, there are maybe 36 full photo albums in the living room bookshelf. Leather-bound, some falling apart at the seams, They are, in many ways, my life's work. My own quiet testimony to the years that passed, the joys, the regrets, the people who mattered. When I feel myself slipping into loneliness, I pull one from the shelf and open it like scripture. I don't just remember, I relive the smells, the sounds, the feeling of being needed, of being loved. In recent years, I've noticed something subtle yet invasive, a quiet erosion of respect. It started small, Amanda making comments about the clutter in my house, Rick offering to help me get rid of things I don't use anymore. They mean the photo albums, the books, the figurines Ellen collected, the letters tied with ribbon in the upstairs drawer. They mean my life. They've started to look at this house not as a home, but as a property, as value, as something they might inherit, rearrange, flip. I've overheard them whispering in the hallway once when they didn't know I was awake. He doesn't need all this space, Amanda said. We should start thinking long-term. Maybe a facility, something safer. Rick didn't respond, not immediately. Then he mumbled something like, "Yeah, maybe. They think I'm slipping, that I don't notice things, that I don't remember. But I remember everything. I remember the way Amanda looked at my wedding photo the last time they were here, not with reverence, but with a sort of disgust, like she was studying an old, irrelevant artifact. I remember how Rick said, 'We'll help you sort all this, Dad,' when I mentioned I'd been reorganizing some drawers, as if I needed help, as if I was already on my way out. They don't see me anymore, not really. To them, I've become an obstacle, an inconvenient remnant of the past that won't move aside politely. But I'm still here. My legs ache in the morning, and my hearing isn't what it used to be, but my mind is sharp, my heart steady, and my will as strong as it was the day I laid the foundation of this house with my bare hands and a rented cement mixer. What they don't know, what they've never bothered to ask, is that the land this house sits on is mine, paid off, deeded, and recently revalued after the city announced plans for a new development nearby. They have no idea what this place is worth, not just sentimentally, but financially. I didn't tell them. I didn't tell anyone. It was something Ellen and I decided back in 2008 when we refused to sell to a developer who came around offering checks with too many zeros. "Let the boys build their own future," she said. "This house is ours." And it still is. Mine. Mine to protect. Mine to honor. Mine to decide what becomes of it. So now, every morning, I wake up in a house filled with memory, tension, and the creeping suspicion that my own family is waiting. Not for my blessing, but for my absence. I drink my coffee slowly, staring out the window, and I wonder what will happen when the masks come off, when the false kindness fades, and when their true intentions finally show. And I wonder if they've forgotten one crucial thing. I may be old, but I am not powerless. Not yet. It was a Tuesday morning in early May, the kind of morning where the air still carried a trace of spring frost, though the sun was trying its best to convince the world otherwise. I had just poured my second cup of coffee and was settling into the armchair by the window, the one with the lopsided cushion Ellen used to threaten to restuff but never did, when the phone rang. It startled me. I hadn't spoken to anyone in a week, and the only calls I received lately were from telemarketers or pharmacy reminders. But this call had a familiar number. Rick. My heart jumped. Not with joy exactly, but with a kind of cautious optimism. It had been nearly 4 months since I'd last heard his voice, and even then, it was a brief call to inform me that Hazel, my granddaughter, had made Dean's List. No follow-up, no invite for dinner, no, "How are you, Dad?" So when I picked up the phone, I braced myself for an announcement rather than a conversation. "Hi, Dad," Rick said, his voice too upbeat, too rehearsed. "Hey, we were thinking of coming down this weekend. Maybe stay a couple nights, help you out with a few things around the house." I was so surprised I didn't speak for a moment. The idea of them coming down was so out of the ordinary that I immediately knew something was off. Still, I managed to say, "That sounds nice, Rick. What's the occasion?" There was a pause, barely a second, but I heard it. "No occasion. Just thought we'd spend some time together. It's been too long." That was true, and it didn't sound like him. Rick was never one for spontaneous sentiment. He didn't say, "spend time together," unless there was a meeting agenda behind it. I agreed, of course. What else was I supposed to do? Hang up on my own son? So I spent the next few days cleaning, dusting, putting fresh sheets in the guest room, making a grocery list, even baking Ellen's banana bread recipe from memory, something I hadn't done in years. I caught myself humming while folding towels. A dangerous hope had settled in me, something warm and foolish. Maybe they were finally turning a page. Maybe they missed me. They arrived Friday afternoon in Amanda's shiny black SUV, the one she always parked as far away from the neighbors' cracked driveways as possible. She walked into the house like she was entering a museum, eyes scanning every corner, every shelf, lips pursed as if preparing a list of corrections. Rick followed, carrying a small overnight bag, and that look he always wore when he was uncomfortable in his own childhood home, a mixture of nostalgia and impatience. "Smells like memories," Amanda said, offering a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. I chose to take it as a compliment. I hugged my son and offered coffee, which they declined, saying they were watching their caffeine intake. Amanda pulled out a folder from her tote bag and placed it on the kitchen table with a casual thud that made my stomach tighten. "We wanted to talk to you about something, Dad," Rick said, avoiding my gaze. "Something we've been thinking about for a while." I sat down slowly, the warmth from earlier already beginning to fade. Amanda leaned forward, her voice syrupy, calculated. "This house, it's beautiful, but it's a lot for one person. The stairs, the yard, the maintenance. Have you considered simplifying things? Maybe moving somewhere more manageable?" I looked at her, then at Rick, who was staring at the table like it held the answers he didn't want to say aloud. "You mean a retirement home," I said, not as a question, but as a fact. Amanda's eyes widened in mock surprise. "Not a home, per se, a senior living community, with services, activities, people your age. You'd have your own apartment, of course." Rick finally looked up. "It's not about getting rid of the house. It's about your safety, Dad. We just worry about you here alone. I took a breath, slow and steady, trying to keep the tremor out of my hands. This is my home, I said. I built it. I raised my family here. I buried my wife from this house. What exactly is unsafe about that? Amanda leaned back, crossing her arms. It's not just about now. It's about the future. What if something happens? What if you fall and no one's here? Rick jumped in, sensing the rising tension. We've looked at a couple of places just to see. They're really nice, and they handle everything. Meals, housekeeping, even transportation to appointments. I laughed, not kindly. So what? I become a guest in my own life? Pay someone to drive me to the grocery store because my own son can't be bothered to visit? That hit him. He flinched slightly, but Amanda was unshaken. You're being dramatic. We're just trying to help. The conversation spiraled after that. Every objection I raised was met with a rehearsed rebuttal. Every memory I tried to share, the porch where Ellen used to read, the tree Daniel climbed when he was 5, was brushed aside as sentimental clutter. They'd made up their minds long before they arrived. I was the only one still holding on. Finally, Amanda said, "Just think about it, Harold. We're not asking for an answer now, but time moves quickly and opportunities don't wait." I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I needed them to stop talking. I felt the walls of my house closing in, felt the photos on the wall, watching silently as strangers planned to erase them. Later that night, after they'd gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, with a photo album open on my lap. Ellen in her garden, laughing, hair tied up in a scarf, Daniel with scraped knees and a proud grin, Rick blowing out candles at age 10, all of them frozen in time, untouched by the calculations and condescension of the present. I didn't cry. I just sat there, heart beating too loud in the silence, understanding for the first time that something irreversible had begun. This wasn't just a conversation. It was a maneuver, a shift in power. They weren't visiting to connect. They were here to begin the process of taking. And what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that I had no intention of letting that happen quietly. The next morning arrived wrapped in the kind of brittle silence that only families know, the kind where everyone pretends nothing happened, but every word feels like walking barefoot across broken glass. Amanda was already in the kitchen when I came down, dressed immaculately, as if she were heading to a meeting rather than staying in her father-in-law's home. She offered a curt "good morning" while slicing fruit with unnecessary precision. Rick followed a few minutes later, disheveled and groggy, murmuring something about sleeping on a too soft mattress. I nodded and sat down at the table without saying much, sipping my lukewarm coffee and pretending to read the front page of the paper. No one mentioned the conversation from the night before, but it hung there, unspoken, like a fog that wouldn't lift. They had come, allegedly, to help. And help they did, just not in the way I'd expected. Before I could stop them, Amanda had opened the hall closet and started pulling out boxes, muttering about decluttering. She claimed it would be therapeutic, that streamlining my belongings would make things easier in the long run. Rick, ever the silent accomplice, nodded along, occasionally lifting a box or stacking things on the living room rug. I stood by helplessly at first, trying to make sense of what they were doing. These were my things: photo albums, VHS tapes of Christmas mornings, Ellen's crocheted blankets, even Daniel's old-school reports, all treated like expired groceries. Amanda held up one album, its spine cracked, the leather worn smooth by time and touch. "Do you really need to keep all of these?" she asked, holding it like it might stain her blouse. "They're full of pictures no one even looks at." I took the album from her without a word and opened it to a page I knew by heart. Ellen, in a wide-brimmed hat, covered in flour and laughter. Daniel on his tricycle, one foot bandaged. Rick, maybe 8 years old, beaming as he held a turtle he'd found by the pond. "These are my life," I said quietly. Amanda sighed. "They're dusty and moldy, Harold. No offense, but it's not healthy to live like this. Some of these albums smell like a basement. We should digitize the important ones and toss the rest." I didn't answer. I simply carried the album back to my study and placed it gently on the desk. When I returned, 2 more boxes were stacked by the door, sealed shut with masking tape. By lunchtime, they had moved on to the attic. I heard thuds and the rustle of plastic storage bins being dragged across the wooden floor. I stood at the foot of the attic stairs, staring up into the darkness, debating whether to go up, but I didn't. I didn't want to see what else they'd labeled non-essential. I went outside instead, sat on the porch swing, and tried to lose myself in the rhythm of its creaking. Ellen had once said that the swing sounded like an old woman chuckling. Now it just groaned, tired and unamused. I must have dozed off, because when I came back inside, the house felt too quiet. The attic door was closed, and there was a smell, sharp, acrid, foreign, something between burning paper and scorched dust. I followed it to the backyard. That's when I saw the fire pit. It was an old metal drum we used to roast marshmallows in during summer evenings. Now it was filled with smoldering ash. Amanda was standing nearby with her arms crossed. Rick was poking the contents with a metal rod. They looked up as I approached, neither of them looking particularly remorseful. "We thought we'd go ahead and clear out the things that were ruined," Amanda said flatly. "Molded paper, mouse droppings. It was disgusting up there." Rick added, "We saved the good stuff." I stared at the pit. A gust of wind blew some ash toward me, and something in it fluttered, the charred edge of a photograph, half intact. I bent down and picked it up carefully. It was a wedding photo. Mine. Ellen was in her veil, her smile blurred by heat, but unmistakably hers. My hand trembled. "You burned my photos," I said. "Not a question." Amanda didn't flinch. "Some of them were beyond saving, Harold. Honestly, it's for the best. Who was even going to look at those?" I looked at Rick, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. "You burned them," I repeated, more to myself than anyone else. Amanda turned away with a dismissive wave. "We're doing you a favor. It's time to move forward." I didn't speak again. I simply walked back into the house and closed the door behind me. I went to my study, locked the door, and sat down. My breathing was shallow, my hands numb. On the desk was the album I had saved earlier. I opened it again, slowly, page by page. Half of the images were now irreplaceable, burned to ash in a backyard fire like trash. I felt something inside me tighten, a knot of grief and fury so dense I could hardly swallow. They had destroyed Ellen. They had erased Daniel. They had taken from me the only thing left that couldn't be bought or replicated: memory. That night, I didn't join them for dinner. I heard them downstairs laughing, watching something on television, their voices muffled and distant. I sat in my darkened room, staring at the album in my lap, wondering how people who claimed to love you could be so careless with what you hold sacred. I thought about what Amanda had said about moving forward. And I realized something that changed everything. They weren't here to help me move forward. They were here to remove me from the equation entirely. This wasn't a cleanup. It was a quiet replacement, a hostile renovation masked as concern. They wanted the house, the land, the insurance, my life, sanitized and sold. And I remembered something then, something Ellen and I had agreed on long before she passed. A backup plan, a legal clause buried in a will no one had asked to read. I stood up, suddenly alert, and pulled open the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. Behind tax returns and insurance forms, I found the folder. Advance Directive, Legal Ownership, Deed Addendum. My name, my signature, a notary seal. The memory came back in a flash. Ellen sitting at the lawyer's office beside me, her hand on mine. "We need to make sure," she had whispered, "that your wishes are protected. Just in case they ever forget who you are." I hadn't thought about the moment in years, but now it glowed in my mind like a torch in the dark. They thought I was an old man, tired and easy to manage. They thought they could burn my memories, and I'd simply forget they ever existed. But what they forgot was who owns this house, this land, this history. They forgot who I was before I was just Dad or the old man. They forgot that behind every photograph they turned to ash, there was a man who had built something worth remembering. And what they couldn't burn, what they couldn't even see, was what came next. The following morning unfolded beneath a haze of gray clouds, the kind that seemed to absorb sound and intention alike, leaving everything muffled and slightly surreal. I awoke early, though I hadn't truly slept, my thoughts having churned like a washing machine through the long night. I sat at the edge of my bed for several minutes, my feet resting on the cold floor, staring at the wooden wardrobe across the room, where Ellen's church dresses still hung behind its doors. I didn't need to see them to know they were there. I remembered each one: the blue floral she wore to Daniel's high school graduation, the dark green she saved for Christmas Eve, and the cream lace she wore when we renewed our vows on our 40th anniversary. I dressed deliberately, wearing my best slacks and the pressed flannel shirt Ellen once called my gentleman's uniform, then walked downstairs to find the house already stirred by activity. Amanda's voice carried from the kitchen, low and insistent, discussing something with Rick that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. Their expressions shifted too quickly, from scheming to smiling. "Morning, Dad," Rick said, a little too bright, as if nothing had happened, as if yesterday hadn't happened. Amanda placed a plate of scrambled eggs on the table. "We thought we'd make breakfast," she said, setting the food down like it was a peace offering. I nodded without speaking, taking my seat. I noticed they'd already eaten. Their plates were pushed aside with the laziness of people who lingered, waiting for a specific moment to pounce. Amanda poured orange juice into my cup, then sat down across from me, folding her hands. "We've been thinking," she began, as if this wasn't something they had decided weeks ago, "about what we discussed yesterday, about your future, and we have a proposal." Rick reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a crisp manila folder, sliding it across the table to me. "It's just an option," he said, his voice deliberately gentle, like a vet approaching a wounded animal. I opened the folder, and inside was a brochure, glossy, full color, saturated with artificial smiles and sunlight. Maplewood Horizons, a vibrant community for active seniors. There were photos of well-dressed elderly couples walking hand in hand through landscaped gardens, participating in watercolor classes, riding stationary bikes under soft fluorescent light. It all looked clean, polite, and hollow. Below the brochure was a document labeled Preliminary Agreement, Assisted Transition Package. My name was already typed at the top. "You filled this out," I said. More observation than accusation. Amanda leaned forward. "It's just a placeholder, Harold. Nothing binding. We talked to someone there. Just in case you were interested," Rick added quickly, "it's got great reviews, and it's only 15 minutes from our place." "We could visit all the time." I closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "No." Amanda blinked. "No to which part?" "No to all of it," I said. "No to leaving my home. No to giving up what little I have left of a life you've already gutted." Rick's face darkened. "We're just trying to help." "You burned Ellen," I said. His jaw clenched. Amanda sighed dramatically. "You're being emotional. It was a few damp photo albums. We didn't destroy anything important." "You destroyed everything important," I said. Amanda stood, hands on her hips, her voice rising. "You're being impossible. Do you even understand how much time and energy we've spent trying to make this easier for you?" Rick stood too, his expression harder than before. "Maybe it's time we're honest, Dad. You're not managing well. You forget things. You let the mail pile up. The yard is overgrown. And last year you left the stove on." That last part was a lie. I remembered that day clearly. I had turned the burner off, but it clicked for a moment afterward, and Amanda happened to be visiting. She twisted the incident into a melodrama of near-death proportions. "You're not safe here," Rick said, "and this house is falling apart." "So let it fall," I said. "At least it will do so with dignity, which is more than I can say for the two of you." There was a long silence. Amanda walked to the sink, rinsed her cup as if to remind herself of her control, and turned back to me. "Then we'll have to consider alternatives," she said. "If you're not going to make responsible decisions, then we'll need to intervene." Something shifted in the room then. Not the volume, not the light, but the air. It felt suddenly colder, more sterile. The word intervene echoed in my mind with an ominous ring. I stood slowly, using the back of the chair for support, and met Amanda's gaze with one of my own. "You can try," I said, "but you'll regret it." She didn't respond. She just stared back, her eyes unreadable. Rick opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. Whatever it was, he knew it wouldn't help. I left the room, went back to the study, and opened the drawer where I'd found the old deed and legal documents. I examined the language again, more carefully this time. The clauses were clear. I held primary control of the estate. I had sole authority to alter or revoke any transfer of ownership. And most importantly, the property was not subject to unilateral decisions by next of kin unless I was proven legally incapacitated. I sat back in the chair, the edges of my vision trembling slightly with the weight of what I had just confirmed. They were trying to move me out by force or manipulation, but they had no idea I still held the lever in this arrangement. They thought they could pressure me with pamphlets and guilt, but this wasn't a discussion about convenience anymore. It was war. And wars are not won by those who arrive late with a brochure. The tension between us fermented in the air for the next 2 days, not loud or explosive, but something quieter, more insidious, a shifting undercurrent that warped the walls of the house I had once filled with laughter. Amanda and Rick no longer pretended to enjoy their stay. They moved through the rooms with measured indifference, speaking in hushed tones when they thought I wasn't near, whispering over coffee and behind closed doors. I heard my name more than once followed by words like deteriorating, unpredictable, and unfit. They had begun treating me not as a man, but as a case study, a subject of quiet diagnosis and strategic planning. Every gesture had the flavor of calculation. When Amanda made me tea, she watched closely to see whether I spilled it. When Rick saw me reading the paper, he glanced over my shoulder like a nurse, checking on a senile patient, pretending to be literate. There was no affection left in their tone, only polite surveillance. I was no longer family. I was a liability being processed. That Sunday morning, I woke to find my house empty and the garage door wide open. Rick and Amanda were nowhere to be seen. But the black SUV was gone, and so was the folder they'd left on the kitchen table the night before. I found a note taped to the refrigerator. Taking a quick trip into town, back around noon. Don't strain yourself. Rest. As if I were a dog that needed to be reminded not to chew the furniture. I walked through the house slowly, sensing something had shifted. My bedroom door was ajar. I never leave it open. Inside, my drawers were slightly out of alignment, and the small lockbox where I kept my passport and social security card was missing. Panic gripped my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I checked the desk drawer in my study. My bank ledger, gone. My checkbook, gone. Only one thing remained untouched: the legal folder Ellen and I had prepared all those years ago, buried beneath 2 unremarkable manila files. I stared at it for a long time, that thin buffer between me and total erasure. Then I reached for the phone and called a cab. By the time I reached the bank, it was nearly noon. I asked for Eleanor, the manager I'd known for 20 years, a woman whose son I had once coached in Little League. She greeted me with a warm smile that faded quickly when I explained why I was there. They took my documents, Eleanor, I said. I believe they're planning to access my accounts or declare me mentally unfit. She stiffened, but didn't look surprised. Your son and daughter-in-law were here this morning, she admitted. They said you were on vacation and had asked them to handle some financial transitions. They requested to add themselves as co-signers on your primary account. I stared at her, speechless for a moment. And did you allow it? Of course not, she said quickly. We needed your signature, but it raised red flags. I nodded, thankful for the resistance. I want to freeze all external access, I told her. Issue all cards, revoke any shared permissions, and move my liquid assets to a secure private account. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She moved with calm efficiency, asking me to verify information and sign papers with hands that, despite shaking slightly, never lost their purpose. Should I notify the authorities? She asked. Not yet, I said. I need to see what else they're planning. From the bank, I went straight to Martin Sheffield, my lawyer and longtime friend, a man who had helped me navigate Ellen's estate after she passed. He welcomed me into his office, a cramped but dignified space above the pharmacy on Main Street. I handed him the legal folder and explained everything. Amanda's decluttering, the fire pit, the brochures, the missing documents, the attempt at financial infiltration. He read in silence for several minutes before closing the folder and looking me square in the eye. You're not imagining this, Harold. They're building a case, probably trying to have you declared legally incapacitated so they can assume control over your assets. I exhaled slowly, letting the truth settle into my bones. What can we do? Martin leaned back in his chair. First, we document everything. I'll prepare an affidavit that outlines your cognitive fitness, and we'll schedule a medical evaluation with a geriatric specialist to establish a baseline of your mental health. If they're planning to contest your competence, we need to be ahead of it. And the house? I asked. It's still mine. Every brick, Martin nodded. And unless they forge your signature, they can't change that. What if they try? I asked. Then we sue them, he said. Hard. I returned home that afternoon to find Rick and Amanda in the living room, pretending to browse television channels as if the last few hours hadn't happened. I said nothing at first. I walked past them, went upstairs, checked every drawer and box. My checkbook had been returned, but the pages were creased, as if thumbed through hastily. My passport was back too, poorly hidden beneath a pile of mismatched socks. It was an insult, really, the way they'd tried to cover their tracks with such laziness. I came back downstairs and stood behind the couch. Don't you have something to say? I asked. Rick muted the television. About what? About what you took. About the accounts you tried to access. About treating me like a senile burden instead of a human being. Amanda turned, her voice sharp. We were just trying to protect you. You're getting forgetful, Harold. You're vulnerable. We're just trying to make sure things don't fall apart. No, I said. You're trying to position yourselves to inherit something you didn't earn. You're trying to gaslight me out of my own life. The word landed like a slap. Amanda stood up. You're being paranoid, she said. This is why we're worried. You're imagining things, accusing your own family. It's not healthy. Then prove me wrong, I said. Show me one action you've taken this week that wasn't about control. Show me one moment where you treated me like your father and not an obstacle. Rick stood now too, his expression tight. We were trying to help, he said, but if you're going to be ungrateful and combative, then maybe it's time we took the next step. I narrowed my eyes. What does that mean? It means we've spoken to a doctor, Amanda said. He's agreed to do an initial evaluation just to be safe. We're bringing him here tomorrow. I stared at them, both of them, realizing then that this was never about concern. It was a quiet coup. They wanted legal leverage, a documented vulnerability, something to present to a judge if necessary. They weren't just pushing. They were preparing for war. And they thought I'd go down quietly. I didn't argue. I simply nodded. "Fine," I said. "Bring your doctor." But that night, I didn't sleep. I spent the hours until dawn documenting everything. Photos of the burned albums, copies of the bank notice, the signed log at Martin's office. I printed emails, assembled receipts, wrote down every memory of every suspicious moment from the last 7 days. By morning, I had a dossier thick enough to defend myself in any court in the country. When the doctor arrived, a young man with too perfect hair and the indifferent smile of someone paid to look neutral, I greeted him with firm handshake and a folder of my own. Amanda hovered nearby, no doubt expecting me to mumble or forget names. Instead, I offered a tour of the house, discussed current events in detail, recited the Gettysburg Address from memory, and listed the medications I was currently prescribed, complete with dosages. The doctor asked if I had trouble remembering things. I said, "Only when I trust people, I shouldn't." He said, I seemed perfectly lucid. Amanda looked like she had swallowed vinegar. When they left 2 hours later, Rick barely said goodbye. Amanda didn't look me in the eye. I watched from the window as they climbed into the SUV and sat in silence for a long time before driving away. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just stood there, hollowed out, but standing. They had tried to erase me, but I was still here, and I wasn't done yet. The house felt different after they left, not emptier, but raw, like a wound exposed to air. I walked from room to room, each one holding echoes of confrontation, betrayal, and silent resilience. The scent of Amanda's perfume still lingered faintly in the living room, clashing with the comforting must of old wood and sun-warmed fabric that had always defined the house. I paused by the mantel, where a photo of Ellen smiled down at me, unbothered by the chaos of the present, as if reminding me that we had faced worse and survived. But what gnawed at me now wasn't survival. It was restoration. For days, I had been reacting, defending, bracing. It was time to act. No more waiting for their next move. No more tolerating their slow demolition of my autonomy. I pulled out the legal documents again, this time to rewrite the story. Not just to secure the house, but to shift the power they thought they owned. I called Martin and said, "I'm ready." He met me that afternoon in his office, the air thick with dust and intention. I laid out my plan. I wanted to initiate the formal process of transferring ownership of my assets, not to Rick, not to Amanda, but into a trust with strict conditions. I wanted every remaining dollar, every inch of land, every asset that bore my name to be placed out of their reach. And more than that, I wanted legal motion against their attempt to override my rights. Martin nodded as I spoke, his face tightening with professional resolve. "You're not the first parent to face this," he said quietly. "But you're the first I've seen so prepared." We began drafting documents immediately, revoking any shared authority, creating irrevocable safeguards, and starting a formal complaint that outlined the psychological and financial manipulation I had endured. It would be submitted to the county court by the end of the week. But that wasn't all. There was still the matter of the house itself, the property they had targeted with such greed and patience. I had no desire to die within these walls just to spite them, but neither did I intend to gift it to them like a reward for their deceit. There was an answer, one Ellen and I had discussed years before, almost as a joke, but which now shimmered with possibility. Back in 2006, we'd received an offer from a local nonprofit that supported transitional housing for veterans and low-income seniors. They wanted to buy properties on our block for a long-term development plan. At the time, we said no. We were still too attached, and the idea of strangers walking the halls of our memories felt unthinkable. But now it felt like salvation. I called the director, an old friend of Ellen's from church, and asked if they were still interested. They were. More than that, they were ready to buy immediately and repurpose the house into a space that would help people who actually needed care. People who hadn't tried to steal it. The price was fair, modest compared to market value. But what I would gain in peace of mind outweighed any financial number. With Martin's help, I structured the deal so that after the sale, the proceeds would be split between a charitable endowment in Ellen's name and a private account I controlled solely. The house would go to those who valued it, not for its square footage, but for its warmth. And Rick and Amanda, they would inherit nothing. Not because I was cruel, but because they had made it clear they saw inheritance not as a gesture of love, but as a transaction, a payoff, something owed rather than something earned. 3 days later, the paperwork was signed. The nonprofit would take ownership in 60 days. I would remain in the house until then, rent-free, giving me time to transition and arrange my next chapter. The director promised to keep Ellen's rose bushes, to preserve the porch swing, even to mount a small plaque in her memory. I walked home from the office that day feeling lighter than I had in years, not because justice had been served, not yet, but because I had finally stepped out of the shadow of fear. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was building something new. That evening, just as the sun slipped below the horizon and the house was bathed in the soft gold of twilight, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I stood slowly, heart already heavy with anticipation. Through the window, I saw the black SUV and the two people I had once believed would carry my legacy. Rick stepped out first, his face drawn and anxious. Amanda followed, her expression unreadable. They walked to the door, but didn't knock. I opened it before they could. "You weren't invited," I said. Rick held up his hands. "We just want to talk." Amanda's tone was softer than I'd ever heard it. "Please, Harold, just a few minutes." I let them in, not out of forgiveness, but because I wanted them to hear what I had to say inside the house they'd tried to claim. We sat in the living room, the same place where Ellen and I used to sip cocoa in the winter, where Daniel opened his last birthday present, where I first held Hazel in my arms. Now it was a battlefield of silence and unease. Rick cleared his throat. "We know you're angry. And we know we made mistakes, but we didn't mean to hurt you. We just thought you thought I was weak, I said. You thought I wouldn't notice. You thought you could maneuver me into a corner and sign the house over like a senile old man with too many photo albums and not enough fight. Amanda blinked. That's not true. You burned Ellen's memories, I said. You lied to your daughter about where I was. You tried to access my finances behind my back. If that's not true, then please, tell me what part I misunderstood. They didn't answer. Rick looked at the floor. Amanda stared at the mantel, avoiding my eyes. I stood, walked to the fireplace, and picked up the legal folder. This is the deed, I said, and as of yesterday, it no longer has anything to do with either of you. Rick's head snapped up. What? I've sold the house, I said, to a nonprofit. The proceeds are going to people who actually need help, and I'm moving to a place where no one will find me unless I want them to. Amanda's face turned white. You can't do that, she said. We're your family. You stopped being my family when you tried to erase me, I said. When you tried to turn my life into a tool for your gain. Family doesn't burn memories. Family doesn't plot against you while you sleep. Rick stood, his voice raised. What about Hazel? Reginald, don't they deserve something? I haven't heard from them in 3 years, I said. Not a letter, not a phone call, not even a birthday card. If they wanted to be a part of my life, they would have been. This house isn't a reward for shared DNA. It's the heart of a life you never bothered to understand. Amanda's voice cracked. We needed the money. Then you should have worked harder, I said, or asked, but instead you tried to steal. They were quiet after that. Not out of shame, I suspected, but because they realized the game was over. They couldn't manipulate the future anymore. I had taken it back. After a few more strained attempts at justification, they left. I didn't watch them go. I simply closed the door and locked it. Not because I feared they'd return, but because I needed to feel the finality of that sound, the end of a chapter sealed with a click. As the house grew darker around me, I sat on the porch one last time, the swing groaning gently beneath my weight. I listened to the wind pass through the trees, to the distant laughter of neighborhood children, to the creaking bones of memory that refused to be buried in ash. I was old, yes, but I was not done. And more importantly, I had not been defeated. I had chosen the terms of my life's final act. I had protected what mattered, and I had made sure the future bore my fingerprint, not theirs. 2 months later, the moving truck arrived just after dawn. It was quiet on the street, the neighborhood still half asleep. As I stood on the porch for the final time, watching the sun bleed slowly over the rooftops, the swing beneath me let out one last familiar groan as I rose, and I turned back to look at the front door, not with sadness, but with solemnity. Everything in this house had been packed deliberately, intentionally, with my own hands, so no one else could touch what was left of Ellen or Daniel, or the fragments of my own life I had chosen to carry forward. The nonprofit staff arrived a short time later, all kindness and respect. They spoke in gentle tones, like mourners at a wake, though they didn't realize that what was dying here was not a man, but the illusion that I would ever be quietly claimed by anyone but myself. I didn't say goodbye to the house, not out loud. Instead, I walked through it one last time, my hand brushing the edges of the doorway where we had measured the boys' heights every summer. I touched the kitchen counter where Ellen used to roll pie crust. I paused in the living room and looked at the spot where the Christmas tree had stood for 47 consecutive Decembers. Then I closed the door. No ceremony, no performance, just the quiet, dignified departure of a man who had chosen to leave on his own terms. The apartment I moved into is modest, a 2-bedroom on the edge of a small park where older folks walk their dogs and strangers say hello in passing without expectation. There's a library 2 blocks away and a coffee shop where the barista already knows I take my coffee black, no sugar. I furnish the space with intention, not nostalgia. A few framed photographs, some books, one of Ellen's quilts, folded neatly at the foot of the bed. I brought only what still breathed with meaning. The rest I let go of like old breath. What surprised me most was not the ease of the transition, but the absence of regret. I had feared that leaving the house would feel like abandoning her, like cutting loose from the last solid piece of my identity. But instead, it felt like release, like the moment you finally exhale after holding your breath for years. Rick and Amanda never called after that final visit, not once. No follow-up, no apology. I received one email, short and clipped, asking if I had really meant what I said. I didn't respond. Some silences are earned, and theirs would stretch indefinitely. I wasn't angry anymore, just finished. They had made their choice, and so had I. I sometimes wonder what they told Hazel, or if they even told her anything at all. If she ever finds me, I'll tell her the truth. But I won't chase her. That's not my role anymore. My role now is to live what's left of this life in peace, with clarity, with no more intrusions disguised as concern. A month ago, I received a photo in the mail. No return address, just a simple snapshot of the house. Now freshly painted, the porch still intact, the rose bushes trimmed and blooming like they used to under Ellen's hands. Beneath the photo, a handwritten note. "Thank you. We're home now." It was signed by a woman named Teresa, a retired nurse and widow, who had moved in with her sister. They had turned the upstairs into 2 private rooms and opened the main floor to neighborhood gatherings. "We host potlucks on Wednesdays," she wrote, "and we kept the swing. It squeaks, but it's still strong." I read the note 3 times and then placed it in the one photo album I hadn't lost, the one Ellen had titled "For Later." I didn't cry. I didn't need to. It was enough to know that the house had found another purpose, that it hadn't been reduced to ashes or profit or strategy, that it had become a home again, this time to someone who needed it. Some evenings, I sit on my small apartment balcony with a cup of tea and think about the past, not with bitterness, but with something closer to reverence. Life gave me joy and grief and love and betrayal, but it also gave me the strength to choose how it ends. They burned my photographs. They tried to erase what made me who I am. But in the end, it wasn't the past that needed protecting. It was the future, and they forgot who held that in his hands. Now I do.